Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week on the podcast, I am joined by the writer, photographer, and designer Craig Mod. I first read Craig, like many people I imagine, a decade ago now when he published this really interesting camera review of the Lumix GF1, and I remember just being completely struck by this piece. I love the writing, but I was also fascinated by the design, by the photos he included, by the tech behind it all. It seemed to mix so much of what I was interested in. I had no idea who Craig was at the time, but I have been following his work ever since. And I've really grown to admire him and his thinking and really appreciate his writing. It's been so fun to watch him grow as a writer over the last few years. Much of Craig's early work was around books, and especially books as they related to this growing industry around iPads and Kindles. Along with the camera essay, the essay that really put him on the map, I think, was his 2010 piece, Books in the Age of the iPad, that began what became a few years of him writing about books and technology and reading in the digital age. But over the last few years, his writing has really expanded, and he's written extensively about everything from pizza in Japan to how to survive air travel to walking and meditation. In addition to his own site, he's written for TheNewYorker.com, The Atlantic, Medium, and others. In this conversation, Craig and I talk about his early background as a designer and programmer and how he started writing and his interest in being a writer. We also talk about the intersection of making and thinking and the type of writing that he's always aspiring to. I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciated Craig's honesty and generosity in talking about all of these things that I'm interested in. I think you'll really like it too. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the sort of director's commentary of the podcast. Each month I share additional content, episode previews, and short essays related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Craig Mod. I probably, like a lot of people, first heard about you, and the first thing of yours that I ever read was almost 10 years ago. It was your review for the Lumix GF1. And I have a very vivid memory of reading it. I was in my last year of college, and it kind of connected all of these things I was interested in. It was about photography. It was kind of about tech. This was at a time when a lot of designers were talking about what art direction on the web would look like, and you had this kind of beautifully designed site to showcase this essay in your photos. And I remember reading it and just being like, who is this guy? And, you know, where did he come from? And if I remember right, you didn't really have anything else on your website at the time, or there wasn't a lot of information. And in retrospect, I feel like that essay was probably kind of a turning point for you and your career also. And I thought it might be a nice place to start to kind of go back to 10 years ago. And where did that essay come from? Or what were you doing at the time that, kind of birthed that piece of writing?
Yeah, it's funny that essay has kind of followed me.
Yeah, I'm sorry to start with a 10-year-old essay, but
no, but you're totally right. I mean, that was definitely a turning point. Kind of, yeah, sort of almost like a coming out essay in the sense of I was hiding in Japan, and then that was the essay where I popped my head up,
right.
Inadvertently to sort of the world. So what was I doing back then? I was kind of just coming to the end of, I had been an art director for an indie publishing company that was based it was just two of us. So to say it was based anywhere was kind of ridiculous. But the other guy was in Seattle. I was in Tokyo. And I was coming to the end of that. And I was feeling really lost and a little bit angsty. And I wanted to work on bigger things. I didn't know how to. And at that time, I was actually sharing an office with Oliver Reichenstein from IA.
Yeah.
So Oliver and I had met about a year earlier, and he invited me to just take a desk at his office. And so I took him up on it. All the stuff I was doing was basically freelance stuff in the background.
And this is like designing, developing kind of freelance stuff?
Both, yeah.
Okay.
So doing physical book design and then also doing a bunch of web development.
Okay.
Like really, really back-endy stuff.
Okay.
My degree is in computer science and fine arts. And I always say computer science and fine arts, and people go, computer science and finance? That makes sense.
Yeah.
No, fine arts. And so I was in need of a place to work because working in cafes all the time was kind of driving me nuts. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting there in Oliver's office, and you'll probably remember at that time, Oliver was totally killing it with these online essays.
Yeah. Yeah.
He web design is what was it? His super famous one, that 99% typography or something like that.
Yeah, I forgot all about that. You're right.
Yeah. So I'm sitting in this office. He's got like 3 employees, and I'm there, and I'm sitting next to him, and I'm just watching him do these essays. And so to back up a little bit further, like I'd always had aspirations to do more writing.
Okay, that was my next question.
Yeah, so since a little kid, since a very, very young age, basically my 3 main interests have been writing, and mainly fiction writing, programming, and design.
Okay.
And I had a pseudo mini career as a drummer / percussionist for like 20 years, but I don't really talk about that much. And that just finds its way into the other work I'm doing in different ways with polyrhythms and stuff like that. And so by the time I was sitting in Oliver's office, I was 27, 28, and I felt like I had achieved some of what I wanted to do, but I also felt like I was operating on a scale that was not what I hoped to be at by that point. And I tried doing some writing previously with the publishing company, blog stuff, but to be honest, I looking back, I lacked discipline. I was tremendously lacking in discipline on so many levels, and it's actually quite scary. I wish I could go back to school, because I feel like I extracted about 20% of the value out of university that I could have gotten.
Yeah.
And so anyway, sitting in Oliver's office, sitting next to him, watching him work was one of my first direct exposures to what felt like unstructured or unguided discipline. Like there wasn't some boss telling Oliver to, hey man, you should write this essay, or hey, put together this crazy visual thing. And I was sitting there watching him do it, and basically he wasn't running the company at all. He was just working on these. He was just working on these essays, and his other employers were kind of doing the company stuff. And every now and then he'd like pop his head up and be like, "Oh yeah, like move that pixel over here." And I was like, "Whoa, this is a pretty good setup." And watching him over the course of weeks and months put these essays together and getting lunch together and talking about this stuff made me feel like that was something I could do in a way that I think I'd always wanted to, but I didn't quite understand the parameters of what it meant to really dig into an essay, to really go for it from a holistic perspective of thinking about the design of it and thinking about the art direction of it and thinking about the editing. And so I was trying to figure out a number of things in my life at that moment. And one of them was I'd never really gone on a big adventure, and I'd kind of been putting that off. And so I just booked on a whim a flight to Nepal. And I thought, oh, I'll just go to Annapurna Base Camp. And I've always been into photography my whole life. I could never. I grew up in this sort of blue collar airplane engine factory town, and nobody around us had cameras. So
Yeah.
like no. I had a disc. We had a disc camera. Basically, it was like taking pictures with like like half of a VGA resolution on film.
Okay.
Like it was just
Okay.
it was one of the dumbest cameras.
Yeah.
Amazingly dumb camera. And so I'd always kind of wanted a great camera. We could never afford one. No one in my neighborhood had one. I was just not. We weren't exposed to that stuff. And when I got to Japan, I came to Japan when I was 19 on an exchange program. One of the first things I did was I like scrounged up the cash to get a used camera.
Yeah.
And so since 19 or 20, I was able to finally kind of satiate this burning camera desire. And at that time, this is in 2000, I would spend 4 hours a day on photo.net.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Teaching myself, reading the forums like a heroin addict, and teaching myself, everything I could imagine about cameras and film. And so I had this strong background in cameras, and my focus in fine arts was photography.
Okay.
I had a darkroom in my apartment in Philadelphia. And,
oh, nice.
Yeah, I was spending 20, 30 hours a week developing film and printing, and
Yeah.
and I had a history with some digital cameras, the Nikon D70, and just as I was about to go to Nepal, this is around 2008, 2009, I was thinking, man, this D70 is getting pretty old. What's out there? And I just went to the local camera store here in Tokyo, Bic Camera, and I was looking in the camera section, and I thought, oh man, this GF1 looks pretty interesting. Like it's pretty small. It's not that heavy. It seems to have good quality. It's this brand new technology, Micro Four Thirds, that just came out. And so those were all the ingredients that I had in my toolkit when I went to Nepal on that walk. And so I had the archetypes of Oliver and his essay writing. I had this deep interest in photography. I had all of my web design background. And I had this kind of really naive, somewhat dangerous desire to kind of go up a mountain without a guide.
Right. Right.
It was kind of idiotic. I ended up getting a guide at the end, but I didn't know what was going on. So, and then when I came back from that, I thought, oh man, that was a pretty powerful experience. And my delight with the camera definitely stemmed from my design background. So, it was about using a beautiful object. It was about using an object that felt reconsidered in a way that I hadn't felt with a camera in a long, long time. Being delighted by the quality, despite the fact that it was smaller. Being delighted by the mode of photography, which was not holding this big thing up to your face, but kind of you could keep it low. There were all these design elements of that experience. I thought, oh, this would be really nice to talk about. And so that was the impetus to start trying to put that essay together.
I have two questions about that are kind of related. But, you had mentioned that you always had this interest in writing in addition to design and programming. And I think what's interesting about the GF1 piece, and then even the essay that you wrote that I think was just a couple months later about the iPad, were very much a way of you were writing about these other things that you were interested in. And I'm curious about that realization. Had the writing that you had done before, was this a new way for you to kind of think about writing as a way to write about your other interests as opposed to your earlier interest in writing fiction? Do you know what I mean? I think there's something interesting about it being about these other subjects that you're interested in.
Yeah, well, I think for me, the big insight was that these things could be design objects. Like these web pages could be design objects.
Right.
And I think the writing is is okay. But I think the reason why those essays did well is because the design was strong.
Yeah.
And the design allowed my writing to not be as commercially polished as it would normally need to be to get the attention that it got. But I think the combination of both, kind of a strong opinion and some insights into these objects, or or the iPad and publishing, but really kind of buoyed by the power of creating this online object, which was the essay. I think that was really critical, and I think I believed I could do that because I watched Oliver do it.
Right. And so you were just doing these for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. And so what was that process like? And you don't have to talk about it specifically for those two essays. You can kind of talk about your process in general now if it's helpful, but that kind of process of knowing that you're writing something that's basically for yourself, that's going to go on craigmod.com, that you can also have full control of the design. Were you even thinking about that as I am writing and then I am designing, or this is an object and you are controlling every element of it, whether that be the words or the visuals?
No, I was definitely thinking about it holistically. But I mean, the drafts begin in a text editor, and you kind of knock that out. But most of the revision happens in the web browser.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it's sort of intimately intertwined with the design process. So it's like anything. It's writing an essay and then printing it out gives you a different perspective. Doing a little layout of it and then printing that out gives you another perspective. Putting it up on a wall gives you another perspective. Just kind of changing the container that the essay lives in allows you to see it with somewhat fresh eyes. And there's just also an element of kind of fun and playfulness to it. It's really fun to work on those like typography details. And so there were a few influences kind of guiding me. I have no formal design background. I took one graphic design course in university with an incredible professor, Sharka Hyland, at University of Pennsylvania. She is to this day one of the most influential people, I think, on my sense of aesthetics, but also just rigor. She was one of these professors that you either hated or loved, and you were either hated by or loved
right,
by.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she loved everyone, but she was this. She is this. She's not. I don't think she's dead. She is this. I'm assuming still today, quite just very to the point. About her criticisms, in a way that it can be beautifully refreshing or petrifying.
Yeah.
And so Sharka was in mind as I was doing all this stuff, but also obviously Edward Tufte and his books, and just thinking about how editorial and the shape of a page can intertwine in delightful ways. And so it's so obvious when you pick up his books that he was editing to the physical page.
Right.
So
yeah,
I was kind of thinking about all of that. Okay, well, how the screen size, and this is back in 2010, where mobile wasn't a thing.
Yeah,
really. And so you're kind of like, well, what's the average screen size, and how do you chunk this, and how do you think about flow and breaking things up, and how do you convince a reader to keep going down the page, to not let them get bored, to kind of win over their attention, and that was all just fun stuff to think about. It was just kind of joyful.
Do you think your design background and kind of working in publishing and working with typography, did that influence how you actually wrote, the way you kind of structured your sentences and structured the essays, not just how they sat on the webpage, but actually the text itself? Do you think that background has any kind of influence on your voice?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think. No, I mean my voice, well, whatever voice there is, it's you know the biggest influences on my writing have always been because I don't have a strong design background, academic design background.
Yeah.
I'm grossly underread in terms of like design. Don't ask me if I've read, this design classic or that design classic, or if I've read this thing. I haven't. I just haven't. Bringhurst.
Oh yeah.
Bringhurst is as deep as I've gotten, but I mean, Bringhurst is phenomenal. He's fantastic. He's a poet.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you really feel that. And I remember not recognizing that immediately, and then realizing later why I felt so drawn to his writing.
Yeah.
Was because, I mean, he had this tremendous literary tradition that he was kind of building off of. But yeah, I mean, I really don't have enough formal anything in typography.
Okay.
Like, I'll give you a really embarrassing story about how freaking like of a rube I am when it comes to design. I was designing Art Space Tokyo.
Oh yeah.
And like I mean that so that's kind of a predecessor to this as well.
Yeah.
So the year before I did the GF1 article, I think if my timeline's correct, I had finished Art Space Tokyo with Ashley Rollins, and I was co-writing that with him. He was editing it, and then I was doing all the design and art direction. And I think that project also gave me a lot of confidence that you could mix written with design in interesting ways, and also just the confidence that I could kind of manage all of that together and get an object out produce an object that wasn't embarrassing and that actually people were
right.
seemed moved by or whatever. But no, so in finishing up Art Space Tokyo, I had all these, all the chapter headings were set in Fedra, display.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember showing the comps to a good friend of mine out here, a really incredible designer, this guy Ian Lynham.
Oh yeah, I know Ian.
You've probably interviewed him, or if you haven't, you should.
Yes, I have interviewed him. Yeah, I love him.
Yeah, Ian's wonderful. And so I sat down with Ian, and he's like, "Oh yeah, cool." He's like, "Yeah, this looks good, man." And he's like, "But yeah, maybe you should kern, just clean up the kerning on some of these titles." And I was like, all the titles?
Right.
Really?
Right.
Like I was so overwhelmed with managing the project. I was cutting stuff at the last minute, like essays that weren't coming in. We cut a gallery at the last minute. I mean, we were just making all these kind of last minute production changes, and I had run out of mental space to think about the super minutia of the design process. And I was like, oh yeah, it's basically done. Like I was just like, we have to get to the finish line.
Right.
And Ian's like, yeah, man. He's like, yeah, man, you should probably kern all these titles. And I was like, what? I just remember, like, I think back on my reaction to that as just being so indicative of how little real experience I'd ever had.
Right.
And it's like, obviously you could, like, what are you,
Right.
what's wrong with you?
Right.
Why, like, Ian should have just like gotten up. I think we were eating pizza. He should have just like thrown a pizza in my face. That's how little, kind of like a proper rigorous design background I have.
I think it's I'm curious about the I don't want to say the aftermath, but you publish these essays, you do the camera review, you do the iPad one. I imagine you had a lot of people asking you to write for them, or that you potentially had opportunities to then be a writer, but you seemed always to have an interest in not just kind of writing about these things, theorizing about them, thinking about them, but also making things, actually kind of putting these things into practice. And I'm thinking about Art Space Tokyo, I'm thinking about Flipboard, I'm thinking about High, that all of these things were kind of coming together for you in interesting ways, and that you didn't just settle on, I'm a designer, I'm a programmer, I'm a writer. You kind of continued doing all of them. Was that a conscious decision? How did those things start to kind of fit together for you? How did you kind of see this these new projects that you were working on?
Yeah, I mean, in part, it was conscious, just in the sense of like writing that iPad essay. I had just left the publishing company, and part of the reason why I left was I was just kind of frustrated by the lack of curiosity that anyone had for digital books, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking around, and I just thought no one is writing about this. And maybe it's because not many people from a traditional publishing background have a strong tech background.
Right.
And maybe that thin slice of overlap in the Venn diagram between those two spaces is actually where the most, interesting work is, and the most interesting ideas are living right now. And so that was pretty, pretty conscious on my part of saying, okay, well, let's really poke that space. And but I think, as time has passed, I think it's true for everything that the most interesting bits to explore are these kind of discipline overlaps.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pretty obvious. There's nothing insightful about that. And so, going to Flipboard, for example, was in part about putting some of this stuff to practice. But it was also in part of like you said, you went back to grad school, you went to MICA.
Yeah.
And for me, going to Flipboard was my grad school.
Right.
I'd always wanted to be in Silicon Valley since I was 14 or 15. And I was programming when I was 14, 15. I was actually writing blog software.
Nice.
When I was 16. Like, if only, again, it's this issue of rigor. What does rigor look like? What does discipline look like? If only I had been a little more disciplined, I would be a trillionaire right now, obviously. But that was not the case at all.
Yeah.
I was playing too much ska music at the tune-in in New Haven, and not getting paid by what was his name? Pedro? I don't know. The guy who ran it was a crazy guy.
I love that.
And so I'd always wanted to go to Silicon Valley, and then I felt like I was just too young to miss that, and I missed that first wave, and then it all collapsed, and then. I through these connections from other work and art projects I had done, I'd gotten a fellowship to the Fabrica residency in Treviso, in Italy with Benetton. I'd done, I just made all these connections, and things sort of started to come together when those essays started coming out around Silicon Valley, and so going to Flipboard for me was about learning how the machine operates, because even in Tokyo I was working on startup stuff with like Oliver, for example, and we had applied to Y Combinator. We were flown out to do interviews. The main criticism was just that we weren't both of us couldn't move to California for like when we did so it was actually probably one of the first 10 Y Combinator batches that was interviewed, I think.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and Paul wrote to us. He's like, Paul Graham was like, "Hey, man, love you guys. If you'll both move out here, we'll we'll fund you." So anyway, it was getting to Silicon Valley and understanding how that machine worked was really important to me for a long time. And Flipboard seemed like the right opportunity, not only from a product perspective, obviously, but also the team was full of good people, and that to me was really important. Smart, kind. Accomplished people. There was the average age in the office wasn't like 21.
Right.
It was probably closer to 35 maybe, or 30.
Okay.
So it was people who had built things, and I really liked that, and being around these kind, loving people who knew what they were doing was exciting and important to me. And I would say that the Flipboard experience was not only transformative for me in understanding what it really means to work on an A-level team and on a product that has that kind of exposure, but the people I was living with two amazing humans, Enrique Allen, who went on to found the Designer Fund.
Oh yeah.
Enrique, he had been part of some things at Stanford, the design school there.
Yeah.
And I was, we were living together with Ben Henritig, who was a filmmaker. He's done a bunch of what he was calling then micro documentaries.
Okay.
And living with those two guys was one of the most important, I think, acts of my life as a human. I'd been living alone in Japan for a long time, and I suddenly was thrust into this house where we were in old Palo Alto, 2 blocks from Steve Jobs' house, in an old house that had no furniture. We had a kitchen table with 3 chairs, and we just cranked. We just worked and talked. And every night before we go to bed, we'd give each other giant hugs. And our refrigerator was just full of hummus. And we made lots of... I mean, it was a really strange, beautiful couple of years that I was able to spend with those guys. And they taught me how to be a more loving human than I think I'd ever been. And so
interesting. Yeah.
I was, learning all of the tech stuff and the mythologizing that needs to happen in Silicon Valley for a company to be successful, to raise, if you're trying to do venture capital raises, you need to sell a really convincing, beautiful mythology. And so watching Mike and the team do that and being part of the process of the product design and going through all the iterations, that was all incredibly transformative. But my goal is never to sit in a comfortable place for too long.
Right.
This is...
Yeah.
I mean, it was really comfy. It man, it was comfy. And yeah, I on a whim applied for a McDowell fellowship, a writing fellowship.
Yeah.
And I got it. Who knows why? And in part because Richard Nash wrote me the most beautiful recommendation letter in the history of recommendation letters. And I used that as my kind of eject button, where I was like, okay, I'm making this intentional shift now to the world of literature.
Yeah.
with a capital L, for better or for worse, certainly for significantly less money. And that was sort of where I decided to transition out of full-time product work and move more into I guess a more certainly a less stable, less reliable space of writing and spending a lot of time with poets and fiction writers.
So I want to try to connect a couple things there, because I think that's really interesting, and I feel very similar. I worked in Silicon Valley for a while, and that comfort was profoundly uncomfortable to me. Also, and I left that for grad school, which I think was kind of similar to you going to McDowell in a way.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about kind of leaving that to go into writing, and I'm wondering, and so much of your writing since that time, you've started to move away from these subjects that you were writing about originally. You're still writing about tech. You're still writing about cameras. All of these themes are there, but your subject matter has expanded. Your essays are longer. They're more personal in some regards. You're kind of, it almost feels like it's a reaction to that speed of Silicon Valley and product work a little bit. And I'm just curious if you could kind of talk about that and kind of that evolution from you are a designer, you're a developer, you're a photographer, you're a product person, to calling yourself a writer and kind of thinking of yourself in that way.
Yeah. Sadly, I definitely don't feel that I am nearly where I want to be as a writer. And the last 5 years or so have been interesting in butting against what I'm able to achieve versus what I want to achieve. Have been very instructive. And Yeah, I mean, definitely everything is getting longer for sure. Longer and a little more involved. I mean, part of that is, again, not wanting to sit in an overly comfortable space of just, oh, I know how this works, and I can do a 500 or 1,000 word essay and bang that out and make it pretty and get some clicks and like do another one, and wanting to just go into places that, I've always had this philosophical ideal with the books that I've worked on, where, at least from a design perspective, I want these objects to be things that are tough for people to throw away. So which is another way of saying I want to respect, the physicality of this thing, and I want to respect the tree that it once was, and I want to respect the time of the people, acquiring this thing, and I want to respect all of these qualities of producing an object today. And the same for writing. I don't want to fart out, a 500 word, a Thinkfluencer piece, just to keep my name in the Twitter stream, for the week or whatever. And so, yeah, that's drawn me to kind of deeper places, trying to get more raw without being emo. Drawing. I mean, again, just like my reading has expanded so much. Like reading like Jenny Offel's The Department of Speculation, for example, as being instructive on how to think about, connecting emotion and science and design and humor, or reading Alexander Chee's essays.
Oh yeah,
which are, he's getting the recognition now with his recent essay collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel.
That's been on my list since it came out. I haven't read it yet.
He's so phenomenal. And so I talked about like not being able to be the writer I want to be, this Ira Glass disconnect between taste and skill. And a couple of years ago, I ran into a wall. And when I run into a wall, I think, okay. And part of the reason why I went to Flipboard and went to Silicon Valley when I did was I had run into a wall in Tokyo I run out of people that I felt inspired to work with. And I felt like I was hitting the edges of what was possible to do global facing work from Japan, at least from the resources and experience that I felt like I had at my fingertips. And I felt like going to Silicon Valley was a way to kind of open up the world and kind of refresh that network of folks that, to be inspired by. And so a few years ago, when I felt like I was hitting that wall with writing, I did two things. I went to I applied for the Iowa Writers Workshop. Right. Yeah. And they do an intensive summer program where you can do 3 months essentially instead of, or it's like two months, I think, instead of 2 years. Okay. And so I was like, oh, well, this is, doing 2 years. I don't know if I need to do that. But 2 months, if I could get into that, that'd be great. So I got into that. And then I had also applied for the Tin House Writers Workshop. And at the Tin House Writers Workshop, I applied to work with Alexander Chee. Oh, and nice. So I got to spend a week with Alex, and that was probably the most informative, transformative week of my life as a writer. Again, it's this archetypes. I talk about archetypes a lot, and archetypes are so powerful and so important. And to be able to sit in the room with someone who is operating at a level that you aspire to, and who is critiquing in a generous, super smart, but very generous way, and witnessing that for a week is so powerful. It's so important and powerful to be able to internalize that and feel like you can maybe achieve a percentage of that. Yeah. And so, spending that time with Alex was incredibly important. And so I've just tried to fold those experiences back into the writing and go to places that Alex it seems comfortable going to, or where Jenny Offel feels it's comfortable going to, or Dennis Johnson does. And so part of it is like this attempt to emulate a little bit of what these other writers are doing. And so, that's
that's it's really interesting. And I'm curious, how do you see connections between those earlier pieces and the type of writing you're doing now, where you were writing about, I mean, I feel like for a while you were kind of the book guy. You were the guy that was writing about the future of the book. And you're still talking about that. You're still probably known as that for a lot of people, but like, I remember the piece you wrote for Eater about pizza in Japan, and I was like, I love that he's writing about this now, and that you've been writing about walking and meditation. Do you see kind of connections or themes between whether you're writing about books and the iPad to pizza and meditating? Are these all ways of kind of articulating similar ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's all design, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
It's like everything is a set of rules. There's a craft to be learned. There's a certain amount of rigor. There's a certain amount of study, structure around studying, and so I mean, I don't feel like these are disparate topics.
Right.
I mean, obviously they occupy different parts of the universe, but I feel like they're writing about pizza is as much this joyful. I mean, the reason I wrote, say, that GF1 piece, or the reason I wrote about books in the age of the iPad, were because I felt a joy. I had discovered something I wanted to share with people. I'd found a secret. The GF1 was this secret that I was, Jesus, man, this is amazing. I want to share this secret with everyone. Books in the age of the iPad was, man, like, look, I've made a bunch of physical books, and the ecosystem is not great. Like, if we could leverage this digital stuff too, we don't have to get rid of physical, but don't dismiss this digital. Like, guys, like, this is pretty amazing, actually, what the potential here. And so, same thing with the pizza piece. Eater reached out to me to see if I would help them out with their Tokyo food issue, and I said, sure, if you let me write about something. And they're like, what do you want to write about? I was like, I want to write about the pizza out here, because I felt like I'd found a secret. And in the exact same way I felt like I'd found a secret with the GF1 or with Vipassana. I just gave a talk. I gave a talk in September at Smashing Conf in Germany, and then I gave an updated, expanded version of the talk in Tokyo here just last week at the International House. And I treat walking and ascetic, so three different things: walking, ascetic practices, and Vipassana. I treat as products, and I do a product design breakdown of
I love that.
Of the product market fit of like ascetic practices. Why, who's the audience of ascetic practices, and why is the audience growing? Or talking about Vipassana, and what is the structure of a 10-day silent meditation retreat? Why is it structured like that? What's the user experience around structuring something like this? Why does it have to be 10 days? Why isn't it 4 days? Well, here's why. Here's, here's my user flow of using a 10-day Vipassana retreat. And here's how it's manifested later in my life, months later and years later. And so to me, it feels like the same set of muscles is being activated in the deconstruction, the finding joy in these things, the criticism of them, as was talking about the GF1 or talking about the potential of the iPad as a platform for digital books.
Yeah, you've mentioned rigor a couple times, and you mentioned that you're not where you want to be as a writer yet, or that there are things you're still kind of working towards. I'm curious how your process has changed over the last 10 years, from kind of writing that piece for yourself to now writing longer pieces, writing for other people. How has that changed, and where do you see that kind of going next?
Yeah, I mean, when I look back at like the GF1 piece or Books in the Age of the iPad, I just think, wow, man, those were really easy. Those were easy. Those were so, they're so tiny. They're so short. Holy crap. That Books in the Age of the iPad is not a long essay.
Yeah, I read it again to prepare for this, and I was surprised by how short it was, because in my mind it was much longer.
Well, I think it's because we had lower resolution screens back then, and everything just seemed you had to scroll more. But when I look back on that stuff, I was just like, wow, man, you were not stretching. But this is the reality of attempting to respect a craft, attempting to move deeper into it, is that you begin to recognize how shallow your understanding of things was at the beginning. When I look back at those pieces, I realize how very little I knew and how little confidence I had about the whole process, and I was kind of just praying that I could knock together anything. It was just like, even just doing something of the length of the Books of the Age of the iPad was, for me, that was the longest thing I'd ever written. Sort of in that vein. I had written, at university you write longer essays, and I had a graduation thesis that was longer, and but those as public pieces of writing for me at that moment were definitely the longest things I'd worked on. And now I kind of have the opposite problem where, Wired approached me a couple months ago. They're like, hey man, can you do like 800 words on this thing? I'm like, sure. And I just did a call with the editor yesterday, and I'm at like 5,500 words. And like, I just can't, because I'm like, well, if we're going to go down this path, same with Eater, like that Eater piece is like 6,000 words on pizza. And that was definitely not supposed to be 6,000 words on pizza. And I have another essay that I wrote this year that's 12,000 words. And so when I say things like I'm not where I want to be as a writer, like I've had a lot of, like, just to be totally candid, like I've had a lot of trouble getting that essay to where I want it to be, and kind of stretching to the 12,000, which is like a novella, stretching to the 12,000 word space. And maybe in the same way, like when I was working on the GF1 piece, where that to me felt like, man, I'm in unknown territory. Writing a long form piece at 12,000 words that holds together, that pulls off callbacks to itself, that that works as a whole. In the sense of, it's easy to write a 12,000 word piece that's like 6 little modular blocks. Right. It's like, oh, here's this bit and that bit and that bit. But to do it in a way that weaves and references itself and points back to itself and acts as an object unto itself, as a piece of writing, not as a series of micro essays, but really as a full thing, where you can't, if you pull piece X out in the middle, you have to rewrite everything else, because it's so intertwined. And so trying to get the writing to that place, and why try to do that? Well, I think there's a lot of value in that, because it makes you be more rigorous in the way you do your criticism or deconstruct things. You can't compartmentalize as kind of a crutch. And I also think that it's just, again, the goal being, George Nakashima, the furniture maker. There's this wonderful interview with him, and he says, like, his whole goal as a furniture maker was to create objects that live forever. And so again, like with this philosophy of making things that live, quote unquote, forever, it's really about pointing to a point on the horizon that's a lot further off than most people think about when they tweet. Right. And so how do you get out of that mindset of, oh, man, this thing's only going to live for an hour or for a couple days or for a month or for a year, to going, okay, I want this to be a little more evergreen. It can reference important cultural moments today. I think that's really critical for something to be of the moment. But at the same time, in 10 years, you can come back to this and hopefully still get something out of it. And to do that, I feel like the more cognizant you are of weaving something tightly and making it interconnected and creating a reason to go back and reread it and imbuing it with delight of rereading to find those connections in the part of the reader, to me feels really important. And I'm still, wet behind the ears when it comes to this stuff. I still feel really green around this. And that's where I'm stretching as a writer right now.
I'm so mad that we're talking about this at the end of the conversation. I could talk to you about this exact topic for another hour easily. But, so much of this podcast and so much of kind of what I was thinking about when I was in grad school was how so much design writing was so responsive and so tweet-like. And I felt like these things, we should be sitting with them a little bit. And what if design writing was deeper and more poetic and timeless in some way, and that was my interest. And then when I sat down to try to write it, the same thing like you, is kind of paralyzing and kind of unknown waters for me too. So I know exactly what you're saying, and I would love to keep talking about that. I have two more questions to wrap it up. I'm kind of curious. You started mentioning this in your last answer, but what are the things that you're thinking about now, or what are some other kind of topics or interests that you're writing about and kind of working through right now?
Well, being alive today, you kind of there's a lot of stuff out there in the world that it feels really pressing. And I think there's definitely, I don't know if it's any different than it was like 40 years ago, but it certainly feels, because of the way media moves today, and because of the exposure, and because people can just tweet to the world, there is this hyper sense of everything is collapsing simultaneously. And so the last couple of years, I have obviously not been happy with the state of the world on a number of levels. I mean, I guess on a superficial level, because on a deeper level, there's tremendously incredible things happening all over the place. And so, for example, I was doing a writing fellowship right at this moment a year ago. I was at Ragdale up in Lake Forest, north of Chicago.
Okay.
And I was using the gym at Lake Forest University. I was going there every day, and they had the radio on, the local radio station on. And I'm not exposed to American advertising at all anymore.
Right.
Like, I'm based in Japan. I don't have American advertising. I don't watch American TV shows. I don't have any of that advertising. And in the gym, the thing that shocked me was just how toxic, how incredibly toxic it was. Like there was an ad that came on that was like, if you're going bald, you're a horrible human being. Your life will be over. We can help you not go bald. I'm just like, what the fuck am I in? Like, I felt like I was in a parrot. Is this a South Park episode? And I just thought, what could I do if I was a trillionaire? And I was like, okay, if I was a trillionaire, one of the things I would do is I would buy up a ton of radio time, and I would make ads about how actually amazing a bunch of stuff is. I would make an ad that was like, today at CERN, they discovered a new particle that is gonna help us create better tools to farm, disgusting desert climates. Don't worry about famine. We've got you covered thanks to this crazy, weird research going on in Geneva. Like that. That's the radio stuff I want to do. And our perception of the doom of today, a lot of it is justified. Obviously, we should probably care about climate change. We should definitely care about not like nations and identity, and the fluidity of that. Like, I mean, all these mythological constructs that basically give people access to rights, certain fundamental, human not just rights, but like, healthcare, for example, based on just where you have. If you're born on this side of the border, you get this. If you're born, it's these imaginary lines that define the quality of human life.
Yeah.
Like all of these issues are so pressing, but at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of beauty happening, scientific research that's incredible. We're coming face to face, I think, with a lot of important and exciting questions about what it means to be a human.
Mm-hmm.
And what does work mean?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we restructure education to reframe meaning in life? What if we could, make it so people don't have to do these things that they don't want to do? Well, we have to rethink education and what is your identity and how, what does that connect with? And I think these are really exciting moments, but they also are fraught with anxiety. You're upending culture and you're upending identity. Anyway, so I don't see all of what's happening as total doom and gloom. And I think on the research and science side of things, if you look outside of Silicon Valley, not everything is a social network. Not everything that's being researched is manipulating eyeballs and brains for ad bucks. So I think there are a lot of good things going on in the world. So I'm not a politician. I do not aspire to engage on a screaming in the moment conversation with politics. I don't think I can be a useful voice there. Where I think I can be a useful voice is around perspective and distance, and also around family and identity. So some of the things that I haven't written about, but I would like to spend more time writing about are our family, for example. So I'm adopted, and being adopted has had an incredible influence on how I view friendships and family and where those lines are and what identity is such a ridiculous thing. And when you remove blood from the equation, it gives you a pretty unique perspective. And so part of my goals as a writer going forward are integrating more of that narrative and that perspective with the meditation and control of attention, and how that changes your relationship to art, and how that changes your relationship to the horrors that are going on today, in the sense of giving you hopefully a better, more useful, genuinely affecting set of actions to affect change in a positive way on a horizon that isn't just about hopefully converting someone on the other side of the aisle tomorrow. It's like, no, not going to happen. How do you affect education? How do you affect these tribal norms that define where a lot of this tension comes from? And like those are questions that require like much make an object that lives forever kind of thinking. In my opinion.
Yeah, I love that. That's so interesting. My last question, this is a question that I use to end all of these conversations, and you've already mentioned a couple writers who have really influenced you, but I'm curious if there are other books or writers or critics or thinkers that have really influenced how you kind of think about all of this that we've talked about, your work, the way you think about writing these subjects. People listening to this who are interested in this, where would you point them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I brought up folks like Jenny Ophel. I know she worked on Department of Speculation for like a decade. So to see such a slim book and recognize the time it took to produce that is inspiring. Writers like Teju Cole have been really. I mean,
he's my favorite. I
think he's a lot of people's favorite, and for a certain kind of person, because I don't think he sold a lot of books. And I think that's also really interesting. It's like, how important is commercial success to what you're doing? And how do you define meaning in your life?
Right.
And I think, Teju obviously has a huge audience with his New York Times Magazine column and things like that. But I think his books, the audience is relatively small.
Yeah.
Maybe 10,000 or so, and that's, I find that to be really exciting that that isn't a, not only is that an acceptable audience,
right,
but if it's the right 10,000, like that's everything.
Right.
That's everything. He's teaching at Harvard now. Writers like Sam Anderson.
Oh yeah.
Who's also at New York Times Magazine. Just for his kind of levity and humor and sharp wit, and then also in that same vein, George Saunders.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Going back further, W.G. Sebald's Rings of Saturn. Things like that where you watch someone stretching, really, really stretching to kind of create something that is sort of genre undefinable. Martha Gellhorn, just in terms of travel writing, and also humor. She was she had a strong connection with Hemingway and was in Africa, going on these ridiculous adventures, and in the middle of the century. Obviously, Alex Shee's work, other young writers like R.O. Kwan. She had her book The Incendiaries come out this year.
Oh yeah, I knew that sounded familiar.
Just interesting to see. Just this influx of support for young, like Asian American writers, for example. Garth Greenwell, for like his really beautiful meditations on the gay experience. I think what was his novel called? I have the physical copy. I've read it twice. It's sitting over. But like just this kind of beautiful meditation of like what it means to be an outsider, what it means to be the expat, and what defines healthy and unhealthy relationships, and kind of disconnected from heteronorms or homosexual norms, just kind of existing in this fluid space of sexuality. Actually, one of the writers that has totally delighted me this year, that I'd not known of, even though she's been around for a while, is Otessa Moshfegh. I don't know how to pronounce her name. I feel like a schmuck. But
I don't think I know this person.
Otessa, her last name is Moshfeghh.
I've seen this name.
Is hilarious. She's like the Operation Ivy of novelists. Like she's totally this like fuck you punk rock literary person. But in a way that is so delightful. Read her. The New Yorker did a profile on her in like July.
Okay.
She is just totally delightful, completely amazing. Anyway, so writers like that. I'm constantly iterating through this. I've been reading a lot of biographies about bicultural artists. So like Isamu Noguchi, for example. Hayden Herrera's biography on him is pretty powerful. And just reading about, again, cultural identity, bridging cultures, and who do you choose to identify with? Isamu had a American mother and a Japanese father who abandoned him almost immediately. And yet the cultural sort of placement of Isamu is more in the Japanese side of things than the American side of things. And in fact, he took his father's name, even though his father was almost totally not present in his life. And, anyway, I'm curious about all this.
I got to read that Noguchi book. I went to the museum here in New York a couple of months ago for the first time ever, and it was incredibly moving experience for me.
Yeah, you got to come out to Japan, go to his Takamatsu studio.
Yeah, I want to now.
It's pretty awesome.
And that was a great list. People often struggle ending the podcast with a question about kind of favorite writers, and I thought that was such a fascinating list and a good mix of people that I knew and totally see the influence on you, and then some people that I didn't know. And Craig, thank you so much for this conversation. Your writing, literally over the last decade has had a big influence on me, both personally and professionally, and I'm so glad that we got to do this. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Jarrett. This is really fun.
This episode was recorded on December 5th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.